If you want to learn how to do modern accent walls in a stairwell, keep on watching. Let's get started. With any accent wall project, it always starts with the wall itself. And with this specific project, we are working in a stairwell, which is not the easiest to work around, but it can really provide some incredible, unique beauty because you have very tall ceilings. But the first step before we get to our trim is to figure out where all of our stud placements are. I grab my trusty stud finder and make a mark at every single stud placement location, which just makes life a little bit easier in the long run, and then grab my laser measuring tool. You don't obviously have to have one of these, you can always use your standard measuring tape, but for high ceilings like these, it makes it a lot easier if you can determine what those measurements are without trying to finagle your tape measure in unique circumstances. After I have my measurements, I then equally distribute the spacing between each section because we are going to be doing more of a vertical pattern, but the first step with this pattern is to determine where each section is going to start with a vertical piece of trim. And for our trim, we are using 1/2 inch by 3.5 inch MDF trim. Now these large vertical pieces of trim that I'm going to be installing first are 12 feet long, and I'm actually cutting the very top at a 45-degree angle, and I'll be going into more detail as to why I'm doing this in the near future. But with these vertical pieces, you're never going to be able to hit studs in every single location, which is why I suggest using their paneling formula, which is specifically designed for applying panels to vertical surfaces and making sure it has a superior hold. However, to make sure that these pieces of trim stay in place, I do take my finishing nail gun and use 2-inch straight finish nails and secure each board in place. Even if I'm not hitting studs, it's still important to do this because that means that these boards will be staying in place no matter what. For this project, we are not removing any of the existing trim, we're just going to be placing it right on top of that trim. However, in this situation, we did come across the fact that we're going to be going right over center on a unique angle piece. But if you do have a scenario like this, use an angle finder like this and then transfer that to a mock-up piece. I always do a mock-up piece first before I attach it to an actual large-scale finish piece because that way I know for certain that that angle is going to fit perfectly, and once we determine that, we can then cut the appropriate cut for our finish piece. I use my chop saw to cut the majority of the shape out first, but I do stop where the lines intersect and then break off that piece, and any of the excess that still needs to be removed can be easily removed with a sharp utility blade. One thing I haven't discussed as of yet is the importance of the fact that these vertical pieces need to be perfectly straight and perfectly level because everything's going to be working off of that. And that's why I'm using my laser level to determine exactly where true level is and then nailing these pieces in place. Keep in mind that if you do have any outside corners like this where the trim is going to go to, I always suggest applying a piece of vertical trim around these areas, and that way you have an end point for all of the remaining accent trim that we'll be installing shortly. In this circumstance, we do have 2 outside corners that meet together, so where they do meet, I cut 45-degree angles, which provides a nice mitered corner. This way you don't have any raw edges or any areas that you need to prime before you start painting as well. The top height of the stairwell is nearly 13 feet high, and therefore we did have to cut small sections for the very top section of our vertical trim pieces. That's why we cut a nice 45-degree angle at these locations, because one, it keeps these boards in place nicely as you're on a tall ladder, and two, I find that it provides a more natural transition from board to board and less to fill later down the road. Now that we have all of our vertical trim in place and spaced out appropriately, it's now time for the main event. our actual trim that's going to be going in between each section, which is going to provide the pattern to this entire space. And for this, we are using more of a chevron, or I've also seen it called out as an herringbone pattern, but personally I think it's more of a chevron pattern. Now that means that we have a 45-degree angle on both sides of the board, and each board gets the same angle. It just differs depending on if it's going to go to the left or to the right. Now the nice thing about this pattern is the fact that each angle is a 45-degree angle, which keeps things a little bit more simplistic. The key tip to determine if you have the right size board is to take your contractor square and place it in between each section. If it doesn't wiggle on you, that means you have the appropriate size. But if it does, you might have to cut a little bit off each board or cut a board that's a little bit longer to make sure that you have a tight fit between each section, specifically the inside corner sections as you see right here. As far as spacing goes, this can be basically whatever you want it to be. It can be close, it can be far away. In our circumstance, we are doing 30-inch spacing between each section. The beautiful thing about the installation portion at this time is the fact that as long as your spacing between each vertical section is exactly the same, each piece should be exactly the same as far as length goes, just a different direction from side to side. So for this project, we have approximately 30.5 inches between each section, which then dictates a 43-inch long piece at most sections. Did that make sense? If it didn't, let me know in the comment section below, because I'm sure you will. As we work our way up this very tall wall, number one, make sure you're careful on all these tall ladders, but number two, the very top section is cut differently, because at the very top we're going from a vertical surface to a horizontal surface. That means that we actually have to go two different directions with our 45-degree mark. Basically just think of it as a picture frame cutout versus what we were doing previously. One thing that did make the installation portion a little bit easier on these tall areas is the fact that I did add the liquid nail to the back side of these boards first, then position them accordingly, and because there was liquid nail on the back side, it basically just held that board in place very nicely while I was easily able to take my finishing nailer and finish it off that way. Also keep in mind that even if I'm not hitting studs, I do nail each piece on the ends. As we move our way to the second wall, the one thing I did find that actually made it easier to install these flush against the existing base is to remove a small amount at the very bottom that's going to be butting up against the wall, because there's actually existing caulk there, and because there's existing there, it tends to push out that trim. So if I remove that slight amount at the very bottom or the very side of each board, that makes it a lot easier to install if you're going up against a slightly rounded surface. Keep that in mind. As I run the bend to the third and final wall, the spacing doesn't have to be the same exact spacing for every single wall, but I do feel keeping them the same as much as possible from wall to wall makes life a lot easier, because the less trying to configure the exact amount of length needed for each specific section. And with the final few nails in place, we are done with the trim. Finally. But now it's time for caulk. Yes, we're using Dymaflex Ultra by DAP, where the trim meets the wall itself. This provides a very nice professional look and feel, especially when you apply your paint, because if you don't do this step, you might see small seams and gaps between your trim, in between the trim and the wall, and that's just not the most professional look and feel that we want for this type of project. And in all honesty, it really didn't take very long to do this step. All you have to do is make sure you have a somewhat nice bead of caulk placed at all of these locations, run your finger across it, and it doesn't have to be pretty, it just needs to be filled. And speaking of filling, let's get to filling some of these nail holes. And for that filling process, we are using Patch and Paint by DAP. This is a nice lightweight putty that I can easily maneuver into every single nail hole that I already placed, as well as any of the seams between board to boards, because these seams don't have to be filled, but in order to have as much of a professional look and feel to this piece as possible, I want to have a nice cohesive pattern without any noticeable seams along the way. There are a couple other nice elements with this product. Number one is the fact that this product doesn't actually sink or shrink on you, and therefore as it dries you don't have to worry about trying to apply a second coat to these areas. And secondly, you don't have to worry about priming this material before painting, because once you have it sanded properly, you can go right over the top of it with your standard house paint. As we wait for our putty to dry, I proceed to taping off all of the surrounding areas in order to make sure we don't get any paint on any areas that we don't want. And as you can see, I'm using green frog tape, which is the preferred tape that I would suggest using in this type of application, because we really want a nice sharp line at every single transition, whether it's the base, whether it's the wall, whether it's even the ceiling above. We want a perfect, nice, crisp transition, and with the paint technologies that's built into this green frog tape, you'll really be able to get a nice, clean, sharp line from the very beginning. Just know that it's going to take a little time and effort to get all of this taped off and protected properly, but keep in mind that all of this time and energy taken at this point will really pay dividends in the end, because the painting process will go much faster. Now that I have everything enclosed and masked off, it's time to start sanding all of our excess putty. I'm using 320 grit sandpaper to remove any of the excess on our trim, which is taken care of extremely quickly and easily with just a random orbital sander. As you're doing this, just keep in mind that you do want to try and keep the dust down as much as possible, which is why I have a built-in air filter on the sander, but you also want to make sure you have a good proper respirator, because you don't want to be breathing any of this stuff in. But now that we have our sanding taken care of, it's now time for paint. And for paint, we are using a Sherwin-Williams product that is only sold at Lowe's, and the paint itself is called Ovation Plus, and it's a flat paint. I also use the paint color Jasper, and I'll make sure and leave a link in the description box below if you love this very dark sagey green color, because I personally loved it. The real reason why we spent so much time and energy prepping this entire area is because we're going to be spraying the paint on. And as long as you make sure you're actually dialed in appropriately, this spray gun really does an amazing job at applying paint evenly and consistently all the way across this entire wall system. It's really nice, especially with the fact that you're getting into very unique areas and angles, and making sure you have a cohesive paint layer is very important in this step, which is why I love this Wagner Flexio 3000 paint sprayer that just makes the painting process quick and easy. The only other tool that I suggest really having on hand with an area like this is to make sure you have a paint guide or paint shield to make sure that you're blocking any of the excess overspray in these specific locations. This is really nice to have if you're in awkward areas where it's really hard to get all of your paint protection on a ceiling or an above surrounding area. And the paint shield does an amazing job at making sure that none of that excess paint is going anywhere you don't want it to. Unless there's some user error, and there definitely was on this project, but that's mainly because it's hard to keep a steady grasp on a paint shield on a paint sprayer as well as standing on a 12-foot ladder. Yeah, little treacherous. But again, with that being said, make sure you're careful on these tall ladders, because we have to make sure we're taking care of ourselves so we can do the next DIY project. As you can see, this is what I was referring to when being on a tall ladder with a paint shield and a paint sprayer, and it does get a little tricky, but luckily the painting process is extremely quick and easy because we're using a paint sprayer. Also keep in mind that I do highly suggest applying 2 coats of paint, especially with very dark, rich colors like this, because you want a really nice, deep feel with this paint, and 1 coat might get you there, but I always suggest 2 if you're able to. So once I let that first coat dry overnight, I come back to it the next morning and proceed with the second coat. After the second coat is applied, I immediately start removing all of the tape around our walls, around our base, and of course our ceiling. I don't know about you, but personally I find it extremely satisfying when removing tape and having a perfect seam, because guess what? After this is done, we are done. I've done quite a few accent walls on the channel, but this was the first one I've done on a stairwell, and there were definitely some difficulties along the way. But as you can see, the beauty of this amazing transformation truly speaks wonders, and having 3 different accent walls surrounding you as you walk up or down the stairwell really makes you feel like this is a special space. However, with a project that turned out this good, you have to see a before and after, right? Well, let's say thank you to our sponsor this week first, and then we'll get to that. With any of the sponsorships that I do on the channel, I'm very precise as to the companies that I want to work with. And with Hoover, it was just something that I had to do. Why? Because for the longest time, my nickname has been Hoover. You can guess as to why. But with this system, they sent over the Smart Wash pet control system, because not only do I have a very large dog, but I also have a 14-month-old. Makes plenty of messes along the way, and as for carpets, it's perfect for a little carpet cleaning. As for the machine setup, it's quite simple. All you have to do is fill this specific jug with warm water, fill the solution tank with their deep cleaning and neutralizer solution, of course adding some spot chaser into the one handle, which is actually satisfying to me because you can actually pull it out and squirt it like you're normally squirting a squirt gun, which is just satisfying in my book. And this of course is for deep-seated spots. Put the wand back in its position, turn it on, and away you go. The nice thing about this entire system is the fact that it has a smart wash system built in, so every time you push it forward, it's washing the carpet, and every time you pull it backwards, it automatically drying and sucking up all of the dirt and disgusting debris that's in your carpet or rug. If you really want to get all the moisture out after washing, I suggest actually using their dry only cycle, and clicking on that makes it so you're actually drying the entire time, whether you're going forward or backwards. And if you're in need for some good deep carpet cleaning, I'll make sure and leave a link in the description box below on where you can find this amazing machine. But as I promised, we need to get to an amazing before and after shot, and as you can see, these walls were very blank, and my oh my, that is one beautiful, sexy beast of a transformation. Oh yeah,